morning, or maybe good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're watching from. Before I get started with my talk, I want to just quickly give a big thank you and a shout out to all the organizers behind this event, especially Corey and Christine, who have been closely working with me throughout the last couple of weeks to answer all my questions and just get me set up with this conference. This talk is just mostly around some of my bug bounty experience and the things that I've done the last couple of years. It takes a different flavor and maybe a different approach to API hacking. And yeah, I'm going to give you some couple of examples and then walk you through some of my bugs and things like that. So let's get into it. Okay, so my talk is called OSINT meets API hacking, and it's just kind of the unlikely duo you probably never knew that you needed. And for kind of an agenda, just to kind of give you an overview of the talk, we're gonna have an introduction. Then I'm gonna talk about like the typical approach to API hacking, and then we'll talk about API hacking with GitHub, and then extending GitHub, abusing Postman, and then some resources and next steps of things that I've came up with, and then also kind of like just conclude the talk and leave the stage and bring Katie up for our next talk. A little bit about me. Most people online know me as Nahamsec. I go by Ben and Nahamsec online. I am what I call your friendly neighborhood hacker. I'm a bug bounty hunter. I've hacked into companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, TikTok, Amazon, Zoom. You name it, I've probably hacked into it at some point in my career. I've been doing bug bounties for now a little over 10 years, and it's become a really big part of my entire career, and it's what I've built most of my career on top of. Now I'm currently just doing a lot of content creation, and I'm also educating the next generation of hackers. I work as the CEO of Hacking Hub. It's a company that I've co-founded with my buddies John and Adam. Our just goal is to train the next group of hackers who want to get into bug bounties, web hacking, or just becoming pen testers and red teamers. And previously to all of this, I actually worked as the head of hacker education at HackerOne, and also worked at a company called Hadrian, which was an ASM company out of Europe that I worked for as a VP for a couple of months. So that's kind of like a little background on me, and any of the stuff that I've talked about also so far, like me and my bio and things like that, are all on my website. You can go check it out on there as well. So let's talk about API hacking. A lot of time with API hacking, what you hear a lot of people work on is a lot of times they try and go and look for these uh, vulnerabilities, what I call the old school vulnerabilities that are in web applications. So you have your API, and you have all these different OWASP bugs like your XSS, your injections, your SSRF. You have your authentication issues, your authorization. You have IDORs. You have mass assignments. You have all these different vulnerabilities, right? And it's a very good way to look for vulnerabilities. It's a very valid way, but a lot of times when you're doing that kind of hacking or that kind of an audit, for example, on a pen test, you need to know a lot about your application. You need to have some documentation, for example, or maybe even have some swagger or anything that could kind of show you how the application works. And even if you don't, a lot of the other times where you're given an assignment, at least for a pen test for me, is you have the front end application that interacts with this API. So you know this is the application, this is the API that exists. Now you want to look for vulnerabilities. Well, what happens when you don't have that piece of data? What happens if you don't have any details? You don't know what the API is called. You know what the application is like. You don't know where the endpoints are and all that good stuff. So what happens with that? You have a different approach when it comes to that, right? So the first thing is a lot of people think about Google Dorking. And if you're not familiar with Google Dorking, it's just the art of knowing how to use Google to search for things, right? So you have your, for example, um, site.disney.com, which is saying, hey, I want to narrow down my search to only stuff that is on disney.com. And I want to make sure in the URL of that search result, the keyword API shows up. And inside of the text of that result that you're going to show me, I want to use the word production. So if you look at the screenshot, you can see that it is bringing up the keyword API is in the subdomain of this wdprapps.disney.com. And right here at the bottom, you can see that the word production was found. This is just a way of looking for information, right? Like sometimes you can find cache information on APIs. Maybe an API route was cached or it was crawled or whatever the reasoning may be, right? So you have these different ways of doing it, but you also are just limited to what Google has, and it's good, but it's not great. You also have the GitHub dorking, and I feel like a lot of people look at GitHub dorking in a one way that is just the most common way, and That is just to look for leaked credentials. They're just going in there and they're looking for things like your JWTs, and they're looking for FTP passwords and things like that, right? You have your secrets, you have your API keys, and you have your clear text passwords. That is what most people do. And you have, companies like Trufflehog and other tools that, you can scan your repositories and they can tell you if there's any credentials leaked based on the keywords and these regex that they have in the database, right? This is just a prime example
There
of
we
this
go.
like random company that I was hacking on. And all I did was, I found these subdomains, and it was, stage API and stage one API.dev.example.com. I did some content discovery. If you don't know what content discovery means, as you just take a tool and you give it a dictionary or a word list, and you say, hey, see if these paths exist on this website. And sure enough, I found that internal was accessible, but it was just, I have nothing to do with it. There was some username and password required. I couldn't do anything with it. I popped it into a Google, or actually a GitHub search, and it came up with this, as a result, and it had some username and password in it. So really cool stuff, really easy stuff. You put in the asset in there, it gives you a username and password in clear text, and underneath it there was some curl command that you can see I've ran, that actually allowed me to log in without the credentials that were in clear text. And if you can't see that, can pretty much came back and was like, okay, cool. The command that you sent me logged me in, but cool, right? Like I logged in. Where's the proof of concept in that? The proof of concept is that I've logged in, but I have nothing to hack on. I don't know what this application does. I don't know what else exists. I don't know. Can I leak any user data? Can I access anything? So I went back and I did a quick GitHub search, and I typed in the asset again with internal, and it actually brought up another repository of somebody else that works at the company that had leaked this, what we call internal accounts. It wasn't exactly that. I'm just redacting it, but it gave me another endpoint that was within internal that I could have now probably not found it with my traditional content discovery, because it was something underline accounts, right? Some internal keywords underscore accounts. And when I sent that request as a response, it came back and gave me a list of LDAP usernames. Cool, awesome. Now I have something that I can work on. I have all these different usernames. I can probably take them and do something with it, right? Maybe I can brute force for passwords again or something. There is a little bit of an impact here, but this kind of made me think, if I'm just approaching my GitHub searches from a very much a one-sided look or an outlook on this, and that is just looking for credentials. And honestly, in 2024, 2025 now, I don't think leaked credentials are big of an issue than it was 5, 6 years ago. We've gotten better. We still make the same mistake, but we've gotten better as just developers and people, and with security posture, that not leak these credentials onto GitHub. It happens still, but not as much as it used to 6 years ago. But it does let you do something really, really cool that is doesn't affect security, but people don't think about this when they're submitting code to GitHub, and that is looking for path enumeration or building context, or just in general extending the attack surface. So instead of looking for lead credentials, I'm going to find these assets that I have no idea what they do. I don't know what the front end looks like. I don't know what the API call looks like. And I'm going to use GitHub to see if I can actually extend my attack surface and find some vulnerabilities that I could exploit, or maybe find something within them that I could report these bug bounty programs. So it raises the question of what I'm going to continue to ask you throughout this entire talk is, what else can I do? What else can I do to take this a step further? So to make this easier, I went through a lot of my different bug bounty findings, and I kind of made a list of all the ones that were interesting. And I realized that this pattern keeps on repeating with one specific fintech, or we just call it a financial institution. Um, they're massive, and it just keeps on happening. And I realized I have a lot of cool bugs that I've never gotten the chance to talk about. And it's all thanks to GitHub and API hacking in general. So, as I mentioned, this fintech company is massive. It's huge. They are global. They work in every single country possible. They either have a domain there, or they have some API or something that they work with. And they have all these different domains. And you can see I've generated this list just to give you an overview of some of the different places that they operate out of. The thing with this is that if you look, every single one of these companies or every single one of these domains is its own entity of some sort, and they operate out of a specific country. And those bring on a couple of different problems, because Each different country means that there's a different language. The endpoints may be different. You have to get some sort of an access, and it just adds a layer of complication when it comes down to hacking on these different assets, right? So the problem that I've seen here is that we have to sign up for accounts on each of these sites. I have to brute force for these paths. I could probably use crawlers and maybe use some historic data from like archive.org or URL scans and things like that to find things that I can hack on. Well, the problem here is that a lot of times when you try to sign up on these sites, it is going to require some sort of a social security number and ID verification. So you have to reside in that country to show them that, hey, I am from this country signing up for this specific site. You have the language barrier that I talked about. You can't kind of understand what they're asking for. And then on top of that, the endpoints are different. So instead of it being an app name in English, when I know it's like bank dash app, it might be something completely different if it's in French or if it's in Spanish, for example, right? And then when you come to looking at crawlers or looking at historic data from other sources, they're limited and also they are sometimes unreliable and outdated. It's outdated because it was crawled maybe 10 years ago from the Internet Archives, or the crawlers are super limited because they cannot go and actually look for data that is beyond the sign up page. So you can't sign up, you can't really see what's behind it, and that's what kind of makes crawlers a little bit useless. What we need instead is some pre existing data that is reliable and it's going to allow us to bypass any limitation. The limitation here could be the language barrier, not knowing what the application is like, no endpoints, things like that, right? So let's take a look at the first case study. Then remember, all these case studies are usually, I think most of the ones that I've used here are from the same company. So for this first one, we found a domain. It's on fintechsite.com.tld. I'm kind of like taking away the TLD here. So it's a little bit less obvious. And the key thing here is that it's on www, right? It's very important because a lot of times I talk to hackers, they're like, oh, what do you hack on? I'm like, the main site, the main core application. And this is a good example of it. The problem here was that it immediately asked me for a login. It said, hey, you have a user and password. And based on the Google Translate that I did using the Chrome Translate, it kind of told me like, hey, you can't really do anything. You can't sign up for an account for as far as I can see, and you can do a forgot password. And then on the other hand, it was like I said, I had to use Google Translate because it was a different language, and it kind of felt like a static website. It just had a login page, and on the other side of it, it only had like a contact page or something like that. It was like a form that was available. So what do? You quickly take that domain and you pop it into a GitHub search, and it reveals a kind of cool bit of information. And those are all the applications. So somebody on here was doing something. Maybe they were taking some information and saving it on their GitHub account. But what they leaked in that page or in that GitHub repository was the name of the application, which was like three letters of, we'll say ABC. There were three random letters, and then it was the app, and then the name of the app, right? So it was like xxx-app-bank, for example. And then it was like the same thing, app bank API, and there was another app too with a different app name, and then that also had an API. I think there was like total maybe three or four of these, but that's kind of what the gist of it was. I couldn't find these bits of information on my own because of the fact that they're very much dashed, they're custom names, and I don't have any tools that could kind of come up with this pattern, right? So it's a little bit harder to look for these. And honestly, all the other methods of like GitHub or Google Dorking and crawling and things like that, they didn't have this information. I'm not sure why, but I couldn't find anything on it. But eventually the goal was to find something, and we did, right? Well, a quick content discovery reveals that the app has health actuator and actuator heap dump. Does anybody know what actuator is? I don't know if you can interact with me. Hopefully in the chat you can tell me yes or no. But if you're not familiar with Actuator, the Actuator is part of Spring Boot, and Spring Boot is just how you can use it to create Java applications. And the Actuator itself is a module that provides you some endpoints that kind of let you monitor, debug, and just have like some properties in there, right? And it comes with a ton of different endpoints. You have the .env or env for your environmental variables. You have heap dump. You have HTTP trace. You have beans. You have all these different ones. The important one is the one that I just talked about earlier, which is the actuator and the heap dump. And the heap dump is just a snapshot of the memory, right? So when you get your access to that and you kind of go through it, a lot of times what I've seen with it is you can find credentials in there, you can find API keys, you can find passwords, and you can also go after like authorization headers and like custom headers that could be used to authenticate, right? You can also look for like cookies and things like that too. It's very, very insanely cool when you get your hands on one of these because it just allows you to understand the application more because you have all the routes and all the things that you want, and you also have all this information that you can fish out of it, right? The other cool one that I've seen that I don't see as much now is HTTP trace, and that one actually just has your entire request. The recent ones that have been sent, I think it logs all the response and the request at the same time. But I haven't seen it in a while, but those exist as well. But we'll focus on the actuator heap dump for now. And when you do a quick little, cat heap dump, you can be savage on an animal like me and just pass it to strings and grep through it, or you can open up the entire memory yourself through one of your applications. But I don't like doing that with bug bounties. That's not worth the investment because most of the times they don't care. They see the impact. But when I want to look for something specific, I just use, I open it, I pass it to strings, and I just grep for something like password. In this case, you can see I came up with usernames and passwords and some key and application names, and obviously the IP address as well that I redacted. So this is just a really good way of doing it. You can obviously look for things like basic. So you have to be very, very specific on what we're looking for. I'm looking for basic authorization header here, and it comes back and gives us a bunch of different usernames right here. And you can see that I'm able to actually take one of those at the bottom right here, feed it into base64 decode, and I get actual username and passwords in clear text. So you kind of escalate your privilege from an on-auth user with zero, uh, any kind of like context of what is on this website, and you finally have access to a snapshot of the memory. And then through that, you can actually get accounts of users to log into and potentially maybe test the application for API authorization issues and IDORs and all your bolos and cool things like that. A lot of times I do that, but that depends on the company. But something like this, the key thing is you have the application now. You can interact with it when you log in, which I don't recommend a lot of times to log into these accounts. But when you log in, you kind of see, hey, their credentials work, so I have proven impact. But also when that page loads, you can kind of see what other calls it makes and if those calls are actually accessible unauthorized. So that's just one approach to it. And the cool thing about that was that you guys remember how I showed the three different apps. Well, it turns out we just were looking at one of them, and I'm not going to bore you with the other two because the other two had the same exact issue. There were different applications. I think they were just being routed to different services, and each of those have different pieces of data that I could just pull from. So different users, different user API keys, different API calls. So I just pulled every single one of them and filed a different report. And I think one of them actually didn't have actuator heap dump. And that's why I kind of built my case as saying like, hey, look, out of the 4 or 5 that I found, these 3 have different actuators and these other 2 didn't have it. So therefore I'm filing them, separately so you guys can kind of see it and also credit me for it. So it was a really cool find. But that raises the question, what else can we do? What else can we do with this? Are there more bugs we can find, or can we escalate this and do it differently? I always want to keep asking myself, like, what else can I do with it? Which kind of brings me to our next case study, and that is also another one of the domains. This time is in a different TLD. I left the CR in there. This time, you went to www.fintechsite.cr, and it just flat out said there's nothing on here. And I went through the usual stuff. I brute forced. I tried to look for crawlers and things like that, and uh, nothing was found. So the problem here is that this website is actually registered uh, 13, 14 years ago. So there's something being used here. We just don't know what it is yet. We have no context, and obviously we have no applications hosted on here based on what we can see and based on Google searches and things like that. So quick little GitHub search we do, and it comes back and it says, yep, there is an actual hidden app that is called app-name-user that's portal, and the CR, for the language is in there too. What's interesting is like even though they're in different countries, the application names are always like dashed, and it's a good thing to know because then you kind of know, okay, maybe it's the same company, even though the TLD kind of changed, right? The top level domain has changed. So now that we have this, the problem here is that I suddenly go into not having an actuator. My goal is always to find something cool like this, because a lot of times what happens is these automated scanners and the bug bounty hunters that are looking for these automated scans are just purely looking for slash actuator slash admin actuator, and then maybe like API and API v1 and like the generic routes, right? And anytime I found an application like this, as always, I want to say 9 out of 10 times there is some sort of an actuator, because they left it behind and nobody had found it. So what I did find through the documentation on this website, or the GitHub repository that I was looking at, was this person was doing some automation, whether it was against their user or it was against, like, they were an employee, whatever the case may be. They were creating some sort of a script around this that was hitting their user and their username from this website, and they were processing the data and doing some stuff. So that raised the question of, can I actually access this? Because on the site and on the GitHub repository, there were no authorizations, no bearers, nothing being passed. So it made me question, maybe you don't have to log in, and maybe there isn't anything that is super sensitive on this website, or at least on this URL. So I go to it, and nice, it comes back and gives me full PII. It gives me the username, it gives me their phone number, their ID, their postal code, where they work, their email address, and all of that great and juicy PII. But there are a couple problems here. So our first problem here is that the program came back and it's like, hey, Nahamsec, we're just super curious. How did you find the user ID A Gonzalez at 61? Because that seems to be very specific. And then right off the bat, HackerOne's triage team comes back and it's like, hey, by the way, can you enumerate more users? Because we think that you can't do anything unless you know the username. So do you have a way to enumerate for it? Cool, awesome. Like, we have two problems that we can solve now. The first one is easy. I can just respond to them and say, hey, just so you know, I found this on GitHub. But the second one is a more important one for me, because I want to show impact and I want to show that I can mass leak a bunch of users' data. So I started doing some enumeration. I tried, maybe I could do user IDs. Maybe they're also mapped out to an integer. So I start passing integer IDs, nothing works. So I go, okay, maybe I could do A Gonzalez 60, A Gonzalez 62, because obviously A Gonzalez 61 worked. And that didn't work. I also tried things like going to users, doing users list, and sending post requests, get requests, and things like that. None of it worked. But then I was like, okay, what if I drop the request from A Gonzalez 61 and make it A Gonzalez without any numbers? And it came back and gave me another user's data. Okay, now I kind of understand what's going on. It seems like they're giving you a username that is your first initial, your last name, and if that username is taken, guess what? We're going to force you to have a number, and I'm going to assume that number is potentially their year of birth, right? So if you're born in 1961, 1961 means 61. We're going to tack that onto your last name, and that is your username. Okay, let's go with that. So I tried to do B Gonzalez, gave me another user's data. I did C Gonzalez, it gave me another user data again. So now we have a language barrier. I need to know the last names, and how do I figure out these last names? And thank God we have ChatGPT and we have AI, so I don't have to go search for it all. So you go to ChatGPT and you give it a very, very specific task. And I won't bore you with all the prompt engineering stuff that comes with it, but I pretty much tell it to, hey, give me a list of the three popular last names, put A through Z in the beginning of it. And I also want you to add numbers from 70 to 99 to each of those usernames that you give me. And I ask it to give me without any explanation and to only respond with one entry per line. This way I can just copy the entire text and paste it into Burp Suite Repeater or like Kaido or whatever tool that I'm using. And I also give it some examples because I'm hoping it gives me like A Gonzalez and then A Gonzalez 71, 72, 73, and so on, right? And it does the same thing with B, C, and D. Cool. A Hernandez, it gave me the last name Hernandez. A Hernandez worked. B Hernandez worked. C A Castillo works. So I'm starting to see all these different users work, and we kind of just found a way to finally be able to go from no context, from no hosted application and no bugs, and translate that into finding API routes, finding user details, and be able to submit vulnerabilities. The cool thing here is this is probably one of my better use cases of AI when it comes to API hacking. I'm not asking it for any data or any vulnerabilities. I'm just simply saying, hey, can you help me at least figure out how to use this API that's in a different language? It's really, really handy when you have maybe parameters you need to look for, last names, and things like that. So, yeah, I wanted to kind of showcase this one because not only it requires you to do the typical OSINT of going through all these GitHub repositories, finding something, but it also tells you, hey, if you have language barriers in today's day and age, we also have access to AI and tools that could help us solve these issues. So I'm going to ask you once again, what else can we do here? Well, before I move on to what else can we do here, I want to kind of note that the actuator approach and kind of just looking for API calls, I did that in 14 different assets for this company. And either I found some API route or I was able to find some actuator that had a heap them accessible to it. I'm not going to bore you with all those different cases. It's kind of want to show you like, hey, if you find a pattern that works, you find some bit of information, try that across all of their assets and kind of do your recon. But yeah, what else can we do? I think this is going to be my last example really quickly. I do know that I have only a couple minutes left, so I want to quickly go through these and walk you through them. So the next case study is another fintech's website. This time we're going after a subdomain. This is a dev environment for what we call an app name. The app name was something super random. It didn't even match what the API name was. So problem was it was an admin portal because it would just redirect me to an SSO, and then just mean like if you don't have any admin or SSO credentials, it means you get no access. So what do? We do a quick GitHub search result, and that reveals actually nothing. We have nothing here to work with. We have nothing to look at, and there's no real data on this time. So this is actually a good time for me to introduce how we can use Postman and find data. And I don't mean Postman as the Postman tool that you use for your API documentation. I actually mean Postman.com. People post their entire specs on there, and it's fascinating what you can find. And I have a couple of examples of those. So we switch over to doing a quick search for the same domain, and this time I find that there's an API and there is a three-letter app name with the word config attached to it. That's also something that I couldn't have found without any brute forcing. So can you guys guess what I found on this? If you said actuator, bingo, you got it right. I actually did find another actuator, but this time it was a little bit more interesting because my approach had to change. And instead of looking for things like password and things like that, I was looking at cookies this time. And when you have cookies and if they're valid and they're super recent, you can actually use them to log in to an admin credential or admin panel like this one. So I wanted to kind of use that as an example of like, hey, I found another actuator using Postman this time to kind of transition into looking at Postman and what you can do with it outside of just looking for API routes, because I think a lot of people use Postman and they go look for it, but they look at it at a super surface level and they use tools like Pirate Porch, which is a great tool. Don't get me wrong, I love using it, but I think a lot of times those could miss some of the details that I have been looking for. So I'm going to walk you through one more example and then kind of wrap this up really quickly. So what else can we do here? With this example, I wish I could actually talk about the bugs that I found, but this one, they have specifically asked me not to talk about it. But I think the approach is something that I can show you um, because I think it's really, really useful, even if you're not trying to um, do the same thing as I'm doing. So far I've talked about like leaked credentials on GitHub, leaked paths on GitHub, and then we've talked about leaked paths on Postman. But I want to kind of talk about like leaked credentials on Postman and also like a different approach to just like utilizing Postman.com. And again, I'm not talking about Postman itself. I am talking about Postman.com. So the thing about Postman is that it is not easily searchable. The data is very scattered. It is very limited in number of entries you can see, and there's honestly too much documentation. Which there is something about. There is something bad about too much documentation, and in some cases it's good, which I'll show that, and in some cases it's really really bad. The problem here is like if you type in Ford.com, it will bring anything that has the keyword Ford and it's something that kind of like related to the word Ford, right? It kind of makes it scattered. This is also from a couple of years ago. So apologies if that has changed, but it's not the what that I want to show, it's just the how to utilize this that's really, really interesting. So the cool thing about postman.com that is great for documentation of assets, like how does the API work, and sometimes it's not just provided by the companies, it's just people have documented it and put them there because they were working on a project or they were doing it for work or something like that. You sometimes get the entire HTTP request, and then it's great for finding paths and credentials, right? So this is a Amazon.com example. It is for the Amazon.com, I think, API for some of their stores. I'm not using this for any hacking. This is just to show you it's not for hacking purposes. It's just Amazon is massive. If you want to hack on their API, you're gonna need some good documentation. You can go to their website, or you can pull something like this that has all the different the calls that you can do. And the way that with Postman, if you've never used Postman.com, is there's a lot of different tabs that people miss. Like you have environments that you could look for. You could look into the headers. You can look at the authorizations. Honestly, there's been so many times, I've gone to the script tag and that's where the credentials were, and not within the headers, for example. So everything here you see is really, really interesting, because not only you can get the documentation of what you need, but you can also get the credentials that go with it, which is lovely. We love that. So this is kind of what it looks like for like Amazon's. Those are fake dummy credentials. They're not actually real. I checked before I came and put these on here, but you can see like someone could leak these potentially inside their environments, right? Maybe it's not within the HTTP headers, but if you go into the environments, you can find them. It's really important to look for these, and I'll show you an example of it in just a bit, because people miss these. So I always find myself finding assets where it feels like a dead end, but I remember to come back to Postman and GitHub, and this is a really good example of it, because I found this asset and I looked for it. This is, a very weird example of it. It's not exactly what I found. I really wish I could disclose that vulnerability, but I have it in writing that I will never speak about it. But this is very, very similar to it. So you type in your domain and it brings you a bunch of different garbage. You can see there's domains that don't even match what I'm looking for in different countries, even that I can't even use. But if you scroll up and down, you eventually find something interesting that kind of matches your target. And if you click on it directly, you can see I'm on this bottom one in the middle right here. There is nothing there. There is no headers. If you click on the headers, there's nothing there. There's nothing in the body. There was nothing in the overview. You go to your next one. You are now getting a curl request that is in the overview, and it talks about the the request itself, and it's adding some stuff. It's adding activity ID, which you may sometimes need it, and it gives you the interaction ID. And then you also have the data that you can take and copy in case you need it some other time, right? The thing here is that we're looking at every different request and we're piecing different things that we need. And you go to the next one, and it's getting warmer. There's a client secret and there's a client IP, and there is a it's a mask authorization secret down there, and there's an event and things like that. There's still no credentials, authorization tab, and header and body had nothing. This is all we get, which the client secret itself is actually really interesting. But I'm gonna leave that alone. But if you click again and go down again to the next one, you actually find something that has a token within it. That is actually working token. It is actually an JWT token that I can use. A lot of times, what I see bug bounty hunters do is they look for something in Postman, for example, and if the first result doesn't have what they need, they don't go through every single one of these. One of the times when I did this, and I'm sure there's a better way of doing this automated, I like to do it manually because of the fact that it gives me a little bit of context of the thing that I'm looking for and hacking on. I click through all of these. It gives me data, it gives me parameters, it gives me values that I can use. So when I was doing this, I ended up seeing one of the exact requests, one single request within the script tag of it, or the script portion of it, had this token, and it was similar to this. And again, apologies for this one not being a concrete example, but I kind of wanted to show the approach of how you can take these different tools, especially Postman, and go through all the what I call the dumpster diving of looking at someone else's garbage and then finding things that could be valuable too. So never underestimate the power of like going through all those requests, because sometimes people fill in their requests, they save it and then upload it for that specific one, and then you suddenly have API keys that could be internal or it could be for one of the employees at that company. So that's one approach that we have. I want to quickly, I think I'm coming to my time, so I want to quickly wrap this up and kind of give you some pointers of other things that you can do, and then move along to get this next speaker to. So I'm not going to ask you again, what else can I do? We're almost out of time. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the examples that I have for this. I think you can do a lot of cool stuff when it comes down to using GitHub, just finding things to hack on instead of using it for like leak credentials that I've talked about, that people use, just turning it around and using it as a reconnaissance tool and not just looking for subdomains, but actual things that you can hack on. So this is actually a couple of things that I taught recently in one of my courses on Discord. It's not even a course; it's the stream that I was doing for our monthly target. It was hack on Netflix, and people were asking me like, "Hey, what do I do to find things to hack on? Like, what else can I do?" You can do some regex on GitHub. So you just type in Netflix. .net, and you look for anything that has a V2 in it, for example, right, or V1 in there, or maybe you can for an API endpoint called users or something similar, right? You got to do some regex. That's a beautiful thing about having a regex search inside of GitHub. You can do more. You can look for GraphQL. This is for Goldman Sachs. Something like Gateway API v1 GraphQL is probably easy-ish to find, but it's going to take you to, a lot of times to brute force for it. But if you already know they're going to be leaking stuff online, just why not look for it and kind of build on people's data, people that are already building applications, developing things on these websites, and just use those knowing that they already exist instead of trying to recreate and find assets to hack on. There's another one. I'm just looking for Netflix.net and looking for the word app. So it's finding things like pre-app down here, a bunch of different assets, and it's pretty cool because some of these subdomains I could find them, but I probably wouldn't find something like pre-app, for example, in some of these, right? So it just gives you both context, a focal point, and also some domains to hack on. And the last one that's probably one of my favorites is that if you have a website that you're hacking on, for example, and you know how they name certain things. So let's say you know that they already leaked JWT tokens on GitHub. You can always create a regex that just looks for the starting pattern for JWT and just look for other APIs that people could be using. So you have to kind of get creative. I know that this company uses X API header that's super custom to their applications. I want to look other apps and other endpoints that have been used using this authentication mechanism. So that's just one way of using GitHub and just creating context and applications to hack on that I've been doing. And honestly, it's been really, really fun because it just shows a bunch of different things that you can hack on. So with that said, I know I'm almost coming to time. I think I may have gone a couple minutes over time. I want to just quickly wrap this up and say, hey, if you're looking at hacking APIs, it's good to know how to approach them. It's great to know how to look for API endpoints and look for parameters and look for all these different headers and the traditional vulnerabilities. But I think, building using someone else's data and using that as a foundation for your hacking and testing, especially when it comes down to a black box approach, is very, very interesting because it gives you a little bit of understanding of what already exists. You don't have to guess for things, and also you don't have to crawl and use the application to create context. You are literally seeing things that people have used for automation that could pull data or pull information or user information, or it could be used as an internal asset by employees, and you can kind of just find those and hacked on them because they are already publicly available. So I hope this talk was useful to you. I hope you picked up something. As always, if you want to reach out to me, I'm online as Nahamsec. You can also go to my website, nahamsec.com, to get in touch with me. Thanks again, and I hope you all enjoy this conference.